frame up the issue, specifically missile defense in the NATO-European context, with a special emphasis on our discussions with Russia on cooperation. As most of you know, last month, President Obama hosted NATO heads of state and government in Chicago for an alliance summit. The summit was focused on ensuring that the alliance develops the capabilities necessary to meet the security challenges of the 21st century. This vision, enshrined in a new document titled NATO Forces 2020, helps set NATO's priorities for investing in capabilities the alliance needs to move forward with over the next decade. Today, I'd like to focus on one element of NATO Forces 2020, and that is missile defense. NATO has been developing a missile defense capability since the mid-1990s. The alliance's initial work on missile defense was focused on the development of a theater missile defense capability designed to protect its military forces from short and medium-range threats. However, over the past decade, the alliance thinking on missile defense began to evolve from a system focused on defense of just military forces to one focused on defending the territory and population centers as well as military forces. There are a couple of key milestones that chart the evolution of alliance thinking on missile defense. The first is the 2002 Prague Summit. The Prague Summit in 2002 initiated the NATO Missile Defense Feasibility Study to examine the options for protecting alliance territory and population centers against the full range of missile threats. So it was the first time the alliance had taken the official step at looking at defense of territory and population centers. Prior to that, it was just focused on defensive forces. The second milestone was the Bucharest Summit in 2008. The Bucharest Summit acknowledged the contribution of the previous administration's third site proposal to alliance security, but it did not, and I think it's important to emphasize, it did not endorse a NATO territorial missile defense. In the third, and I think in many ways one of the most important kind of pieces of the puzzle, was the announcement in September 2009 by President Obama of the European Phase Adaptive Approach, or EPAA. As most of you know, the EPAA consists of 4 phases designed to evolve as the missile threat from the Middle East evolves. Phase 1, in the 2011 timeframe, called for the deployment of Aegis ships in the Mediterranean and the deployment of a radar in southeastern Europe designed to protect U.S. forces and friends and allies against short and medium-range threats. As many of you know, last year with the deployment of the USS Monterey and the deployment of an ANTP-2 radar in Turkey, Phase 1 is complete. Phase 2 in the 2015 timeframe calls for several new capabilities. First, we will see the introduction of what we call a land-based version of the SM-3 missile in Romania, and that agreement was signed and ratified last year. Secondly, we will see the evolution of a new version of the SM-3 missile, the SM-3 Block 1B, which will give the missile capability to deal with more sophisticated threats. Like Phase 1, Phase 2 is designed to deal with short and medium-range ballistic missile threats from the Middle East. Phase 3, in the 2018 timeframe, you start to see the evolution of some new capabilities. First, you have a second land-based SM-3 site, which will be deployed in Poland. But more importantly, you will see the introduction of a new missile, the SM-3 Block 2A, which we are currently co-developing with Japan, which will give us the capability of dealing with intermediate range threats to Europe. And then finally, in Phase 4, in the 2020 timeframe, we will have the deployment of a new version of the SM-3. I always like to say a good, better, and even better version of the SM-3, the SM-3 Block 2B, which will give us capability to deal with some types of long-range threats capable of reaching to the United States, number one. And two, it will enhance our capability to deal with intermediate-range threats to Europe. In laying out the announcement, President Obama also indicated that the United States planned to make U.S. EPAA assets available to NATO as a U.S. National contribution to a future alliance missile defense capability. At the NATO Lisbon Summit in November 2010, alliance heads of state and government agreed to the following three things. First, they agreed to develop a missile defense capability to defend alliance territory and population centers. That's a first. Two, they agreed to upgrade the NATO Active Layer Theater Ballistic Missile Defense Command and Control System, as we like to say, ALT-BMD, to allow that system to conduct the territorial missile defense mission. And thirdly, they welcomed the EPAA as a U.S. national contribution to the eventual NATO system. With regards to the cost, about what is NATO contributing, I think it's important to note that NATO is committed through the development of the Theater Missile Defense Command and Control System, as well as the upgrades to that system for territorial missile defense, almost $1 billion for missile defense. So I think there's a lot of questions here. What are the allies providing? Well, I think it's really important that the alliance as a whole is spending almost $1 billion, probably more depending on how you factor that in. And that's not counting the individual potential contributions from other nations. Shortly after the conclusion of the Lisbon Summit in November of 2010, the alliance began the hard work to make the NATO missile defense system a reality. In Chicago last month, NATO announced that it had now achieved an interim ballistic missile defense capability, the first implementation of the Lisbon Commitment. This means that the alliance has initiated an operationally meaningful standing peacetime ballistic missile defense mission similar to other missions. NATO has also agreed on the command and control procedures for ballistic missile defense, designated Admiral Stavridis in his capacity as SACEUR as the commander for the mission, and demonstrated an interoperable command and control capability funded by all allies through the ALT-BMD system. Now that the alliance is declaring this capability, the United States will offer its EPAA assets to the alliance as a voluntary national contribution to this mission, and will welcome contributions from other allies. These policy objectives are explicitly stated in the 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review. For example, in Chicago, the President announced that he had directed the transfer of the ANTPY-2 radar deployed in Turkey to NATO operational control. This follows our standard practice. The United States routinely transfers operational control of U.S. defense capabilities to NATO, including for our efforts in Afghanistan, Libya, in Kosovo, and elsewhere in Europe. As with any national contribution, the U.S. reserves the right to transfer assets back to national control if necessary. As you know, the EPAA also relies on ballistic missile defense capable Aegis ships. While the President at Chicago announced the immediate transfer of the radar in Turkey, command and control authority over BMD capable ships will only be transferred to NATO when required in a crisis. The reason for this is Aegis ships perform other missions besides missile defense. This week, I think last month's announcement made clear that while we still have additional work to do on the NATO missile defense capability, we are making good progress. And there's still a lot of work to do. But again, I think NATO has come a long way since the late 1990s when their work was focused solely on defense of forces, and they've evolved in a way to deal with threat to territory and population centers. Let me now briefly say a few things about missile defense cooperation with Russia. President Obama, like most of his recent predecessors, has made missile defense cooperation a key priority. Over the past several years, the United States has had a robust dialogue with Russia on missile defense cooperation, both bilaterally and at NATO. Let me talk a little bit about some of the things we've been doing bilaterally, and then I'll talk about the work at NATO. The U.S. bilateral track with Russia has basically been conducted through two channels. The first channel, my boss, well, she's not my boss anymore, but Undersecretary Tauscher, former Undersecretary Tauscher, who used to be my boss, but we have a saying, it's kind of like when you work for Ellen, once you're in the mafia, you never get out, so I still refer to her as my boss. But she has the lead through the Arms Control and International Security Working Group of the bilateral U.S.-Russia bilateral commission to work with her foreign ministry counterpart on the policy issues associated with missile defense cooperation. And then on the defense-to-defense side, we have Jim Miller, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and his counterpart, Anatoly Antonov, who are working more technical issues. As you well know, Russia has expressed a number of concerns about U.S. and NATO missile defenses, most importantly that it could potentially undermine their strategic deterrent. And they've called for, quote, legally binding guarantees and objective criteria to reassure them. Now, we've made it very clear that legally binding guarantees and objective criteria, which primarily are designed to limit U.S. missile defense systems, are not on the table, period. But what we are prepared to do is to work with the Russians in a cooperative manner to provide them the insight that they need, number one. And two, I think we really do believe that as time evolves, we will face a very similar threat mutually from ballistic missiles. Now, what we have done on the bilateral basis has laid out 3 or 4 key projects to kind of kickstart cooperation. The first is the completion of the Defense Technology Cooperation Agreement. Now, if you are going to have any type of cooperation with Russia in the defense area, you need to have a legal mechanism to allow you to exchange information. There is no current legal mechanism that we have to exchange information. Now, I think it's important to note that negotiation on the defense technology cooperation began in 2004 in the previous administration, and it's not just focused on missile defense, but cooperation writ large, across a number of areas. So, one, the Defense Technology Cooperation Agreement to facilitate the exchange of information. Two, as I mentioned just previously, the Russians have indicated that they are concerned about the potential impact of our missile defenses on their strategic deterrent. We reject that idea for a number of reasons, but we said to the Russians, okay, we understand your concerns. Why don't we do some joint modeling and simulation, and we can show our capabilities, what we think they do, and you can provide your thoughts. The third issue that we have talked about, and I think a very good pragmatic approach, is the establishment of 2 NATO-Russia centers. The first center would be focused on data exchange with regard from sensor data. One of the things where we have some disagreements with our Russian colleagues is over the issue of the threat from the Middle East. And we said, well, let's establish one center that shares data information, sensor information, and we can compare. So that's one. And secondly, a second center focused on planning and operations. Now, we've made it very clear that we will not have a joint system with Russia. NATO will be responsible for protecting NATO, and Russia will be responsible for protecting Russia. But there could be situations where we might want to have a coordinated defense. And so one of the things that we have proposed is setting up a Missile Defense Planning and Operations Center. So in scenarios where we are both dealing with a mutual threat, we can coordinate our plans and operations. And secondly, and more importantly with this would provide the Russians more insight into kind of our planning procedures so they can get a better understanding as to what our missile defenses are directed against and what they are not directed against. And then finally, the fourth area of practical cooperation, we've actually made a little progress here, is the resumption of the NATO-Russia and US-Russia theater missile defense exercises. Many of you may not know, but throughout the 1990s and well into the previous decade, we had a highly successful theater missile defense exercise with the Russians on a bilateral basis, and we also had another very highly successful NATO-Russia theater missile defense work program. And I would argue that under the previous program of work of the NATO-Russia Council, the work on theater missile defense was probably one of the most successful areas of cooperation. And just to note that in the run-up to the Chicago summit, we were able to have the first NATO-Russia theater missile defense exercise in 4 years. So that's a little bit of progress. Not much, but these things happen in baby steps. Let me talk a little bit about NATO-Russia cooperation, and then I'll kind of sum up with kind of where we are with the overarching prospects for cooperation with Russia. At the NATO-Russia summit in Lisbon in November 2010, NATO and Russia did three key things with regards to missile defense. First, they completed a joint ballistic missile threat assessment and agreed to continue dialogue. Second, they agreed to resume theater missile defense cooperation. And third, they tasked the NATO-Russia Council to develop a comprehensive joint analysis of the future framework for missile defense cooperation for defense of territories and population centers. As I noted just previously, we were able to have the first theater missile defense exercise in 4 years in April of this year, but other work on NATO-Russia missile defense has stalled over Russia's desire for legally binding guarantees. Again, we've reiterated both bilaterally as well as within the context of NATO that the alliance is not prepared to provide legally binding guarantees, but we are prepared to provide a political assurance. For example, in the Chicago Summit Declaration, Alliance heads of state and government stated the following with regards to missile defense cooperation with Russia. They said, quote, "Given our shared interest with Russia, we remain committed to cooperation on missile defense in the spirit of mutual trust and reciprocity, such as the recent NATO-Russia theater missile defense exercise. NATO missile defenses are not directed against Russia and will not undermine Russia's strategic deterrence capabilities. NATO missile defense is intended to defend against potential threats emanating from outside the Euro-Atlantic region." End quote. That said, I think it's unlikely that you're going to see any movement on missile defense cooperation between the United States and Russia, and NATO and Russia, between now and the U.S. presidential election in November of this year. That said, I think it's important to note that in their June 18th joint statement in Los Cabos, Mexico, Presidents Obama and Putin agreed that, quote, "Despite differences in assessments, we have agreed to continue a joint search for solutions to the challenges in the field of missile defense," end quote. So, in conclusion, I think the Chicago summit was focused on ensuring that NATO has the necessary capabilities to meet the challenges of the 21st century. I think the declaration of interim capability for missile defense and the successful show that shows that the alliance is making significant progress in this area, though there's a lot more work that will be required to bring the system up to full operational capability. Finally, while no major progress has been made with regards to missile defense cooperation with Russia, this remains a priority for President Obama, for NATO alliance heads of state in government, and we are continuing our discussions with the hopes of narrowing our differences. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.